He humiliated me 99 times. The number sat in Lin Mian like a bruise, an ugly, precise tally that she could feel under her skin when she woke and before she slept. It arrived at the most ordinary moments: a forkful of food stolen from her plate by a favored hand, a sharp laugh across a crowded room, a whispered wager behind a crystal glass. Each humiliation was small enough to deny itself as cruelty, large enough together to become a life. At the banquet the year she turned 24, they made sport of her in the round. Her adoptive sister, Lin Yuanyuan, rose to toast, and the room leaned in, because Lin Yuanyuan always commanded the lean. She was the kind of woman who owned the air around her: high cheekbones, practiced laughter, the perfumed halo of someone who had never worried a single day about being attended to or ignored. Yuanyuan tilted of champagne toward her father, and then toward the circle that mattered: the Zhang family, the influential presses, the men who could open doors. And on the third tilt, the eyes brushed Lin Mian as if she were a smudge that needed inspecting. Gu Huaichuan was at the head table. He watched with that old, quiet amusement he kept for little dramas. When Lin Yuanyuan made a pointed joke about fortune's right-hand choices, two men at their table exchanged a look, and someone, a man with heavy cuffs and a laugh like a gavel, called across to Lin Mian, "Isn't your sister the family's treasure? Come show us your smile, girl." She rose because refusal in that room would have escalated into spectacle. She moved slow because speed would be to admit embarrassment, and the moment stretched until everyone knew the length of the humiliation. A hand from the back table, Gu's hand, neat and gloved, tightened around the heirloom bracelet on her wrist and tugged it free as though it were a prize. The bracelet was her mother's thing, jade threaded with tiny gold. It was small and cheap to anyone who didn't know how the metal had been soldered with apology, and the stone cupped like a saved breath. Gu dangled it between his fingers with the cool detachment of a man who valued everything as a display. The room laughed at the performative cruelty. Lin felt the metal cold on her arm for a second longer, and then it was gone. System. Humiliation count incremented. 92/100. The notification was a chime in her chest only she could hear. The system's voice lingered everywhere it was supposed to: on the edge of phones, in the mirror of her glassy reflection, in the secret app that pulsed black and white when no one was looking. It never ridiculed, never took sides. It announced clinically the metrics she had promised herself to watch: love scores, targets, mission progress, wishes available. She had not been looking for a machine to tally her pain. She had been looking for leverage. Lin Mian had swallowed humiliation and named it research. It allowed her to study the patterns in the way people wielded privilege. Where others found misery, she found variables: who spoke first, how a slight could be escalated into a betting line, which men deferred to which gestures. If she could learn the rules, she could place herself where luck could be manufactured. The system handed that possibility to her like a scalpel. System. Host profile, Lin Mian. Eligibility, verified. Mission offered, reclaim. The invitation came on a night when rain made the city breathe like an animal, and the Lin estate smelled of lemon oil and old wood. Her father pretended not to notice her presence. He had never pretended to love her. He had only pretended, with care, to preserve the family image. Her mother, exhausted smiling in social pictures and sharper off-camera, had a silence that felt like a verdict. It was because of this carved-in-place indifference that she had learned to fold herself into the wall corners and listen. Gu, who used the modest poor student persona when it suited his narratives, and the chilling Master Gu persona when it suited deals, had made those humiliations elegant. He liked to put things on display, to rearrange people's positions like he was playing chess with living pieces. He loved to watch the outcomes, the way the room reoriented when he declared someone unimportant or useful. He had loved Lin Mian once, or something like it, which complicated his cruelty. Love mixed with ownership is often cruel. The system did not offer answers. It offered tasks and the possibility of wishes. Each mission, if completed, moved love scores and unlocked limited, powerful favors. A wish could be a cure, a wealth transfer, a legal slip of paper that made someone else's claims dissolve. The price, Lin knew well, was always in choices: what to ask for, whom to hurt, and whether erasing memory meant erasing reckoning. She closed on her decision the way one of her family closed on dinners, with a private, decisive nod.
The first mission was surgical, not flashy, precise. Make Gu's pride falter publicly enough to become readable. Nudge the story so someone else would notice the cracks. It was not revenge. It was a strategy to expose the arithmetic of power. System. Mission accepted. Target, Gu Huaichuan. Objective, shift perceived dominance. Reward, wish credit, +1. You're walking into a game, her mother said only once, later, as if she might accidentally reveal complicity in her daughter's life. I know how to play, Lin said. She did not tell her mother about the bruise count that lived like a ledger in her pocket. She did not tell her that she had learned to pare her face down into a public neutrality that could pass as dignity. If dignity could be studied and performed, then it could be weaponized.
They began with small measures, a misdelivered invitation, a rumor carefully seeded about Gu's debts, a photograph taken out of sequence showing Gu's hand on the sleeve of a woman who was not his fiancée. Each nudge was a test. Each test the system annotated. Her phone dinged at odd hours with crisp, unemotional lines. System, Gu love score, 73%. System, host intervention success, +1. Gu noticed. Men like him notice slights that implicate control. He called her to the terrace at midnight once, as if to chastise the player who thought she might pull at the edges of his tapestry. The air was thin with the ocean smell. The property jutted out from the cliff like an insult to steady land, and Gu's voice was low enough to be almost a confession. You keep moving the pieces, Mian, he said. Do you think you can rearrange me? She looked at him properly for the first time that night. He was younger when he wasn't pretending to be older. Laugh lines that weren't his were borrowed from smoking rooms and poker tables. There was a tenderness there that made her chest ache for a moment, a flash of what could have been, but she swallowed it because he had used tenderness the way a surgeon uses a scalpel to make necessary incisions. I move pieces to see what falls, she said. It's the only way to know who you really are. He smiled in that complicated way that hinted he'd been both admirer and proprietor. And what if you find out and you don't like the answer? Then I prepare to change it. He left after that with his hands in his pockets and an expression that could be read both as respect and warning. The system recorded it as a response, neutral and efficient. System, Gu response detected. Love score fluctuation, 77%. Those early moves were the quiet kind of violence. Reputations shifted invisibly, and men's eyes wavered where they had been anchored. People began to look. But the true leverage came when others began to place bets on outcomes. Bets transferred moral weight into financial weight. They meant a public ledger had been opened. Once the ledger was visible, prestige could be taxed. At the casino event 3 months later, the room smelled of smoke and citrus and the electric hum of power. The bet was called in the middle of a public auction, and Gu, ever composed, found himself at the center of the air, a man people watched with interest. The task had been to bait and not to break, to make him lose pride but not to humiliate him so cruelly that he became dangerous. She had perfected cruel, and she had learned compassion for the future. The difference between breaking someone for sport and breaking someone to build a bridge. A man with a gambler's mouth offered odds on Gu's reaction to a test. It was an old game. You bet on a man's capacity to hold, to lose, to smile through the collapse. Lin stood at the periphery and watched, jaw tight. The bet's most perverse beauty was that it used Lin as collateral, a living prop.
Someone placed a stack of chips in the center and said, loud enough for cameras, if Gu can't hold himself when Lin is publicly wronged again, I take the bracelet. It was a dangerous turn. It made her a sealed thing, collateral in a man's wager. The room turned to watch as Yuanyuan arranged another sleight. It was artful and cruel. She picked at Lin's dress in front of a camera, snapping the seam to reveal a thin stripe of lace at the shoulder. A commentator laughed and called it a fashion crime, and the cameras ate the moment whole. Gu left his seat. He returned with the bracelet in his hand. His fingers closed around the jade like a possession. He held it up not to taunt, that would have made the moment savage, but to demonstrate control. It was the same move as in the banquet, but the stakes were different. This time, the cameras recorded, the reporters hurried with headlines, and someone on the edge of the room put the clip on the feed that looped across feeds like a ripple. The screen flashed in 100 living rooms. The ledger in the system updated. System. Humiliation count incremented. 95, 100. Lin counted them when the house went quiet. 95. The number moved through her like a cold draft. In private, she took the bracelet back under pretense, the jade cool and familiar, and she let her thumb trace the tiny fracture at one link, where a solder had never quite been smooth. It was a flaw someone could have used to say ugly things about her mother,
but she kept the thought to herself. Flaws were proof that things could be repaired. She began to play a longer game. The system's missions were not only about exposing or breaking people, they could also be about healing. The reward credit could be spent on anything the rules enumerated: a healing wish, a legal wipe, a sum that turned into property deeds. The ethics of the wishes were a field she had to walk through carefully, because getting what you wanted could cost someone what they needed to keep themselves whole. The system made no moral judgments, it only enforced consequences. Gu's leg, the injury he'd kept like a secret study, had once been repaired by a whisper, a rumor of a specialist who had never existed. After that, Gu walked without the limp that had once softened his presence. He used the healed body like a talisman to assert dominion at social events. When the limp returned, subtle at first, a small hitch in his gait at the casino, he made jokes about it and then hid the glance that asked her to notice and to not make a spectacle. The reappearance of that limp was a variable she had not anticipated, and a lever she could nonetheless choose to use. "Why are you doing this?" he asked her, once in a corridor that smelled of lemon wax and cigarette smoke. "For what purpose is this theater?" "For a purpose," she said, and named the sleek word like a tool. "For survival." The corridor had mirrors. His face reflected back at them from different angles. In another life, his face could have been warm, but habit had carved it into architecture. In the reflection, his eyes flicked with something close to admiration, and then he tightened them again. "You play a dangerous games." She watched the small memory of his softness dissociate into the man who made wagers and framed women. It made her pity him without softening what she planned. System. Mission progress. G dominance sift. 60% complete. That night, after the event, she sat beneath a single lamp in a narrow room and opened the system interface for the first time in full. The UI was spare and flat, a white on black that felt like a surgeon's chart. The options were clinical, efficient. Wish ledger, 0. Active missions, 1. Target list, Gu Huaichuan. Available tools, rumor seeding, social algorithmic boosts, physical props. The purchase of a wish required points and the right pattern of outcomes. There was one option that made her stomach turn and that made the hair on her forearm stand up. Memory erasure wish. It read like a paragraph in a medical ethics textbook. Removes select memories of the host from the minds of designated recipients. Usage consequences, long-term social dissonance, trauma displacement, potential self-identity fragmentation. Quantity, 1 per full mission cascade. She tapped it, and the screen hummed. The system offered an example case. Erase the memory of your existence from a chosen person's mind, granting the host asylum from ongoing emotional leverage. It came with a moral footnote. Loss of memory is not indemnity from past acts. Collateral emotional damage is likely. Lin thought of Gu's hand on the bracelet, of the way her father's eyes slid when he pretended not to hear, of nights where humiliation made her feel hollow. The idea of being able to take those faces cleanly from the people who had used her was intoxicating and terrible at once. The system, for all its coldness, knew the kinds of wishes people would desire. She did not spend the wish then. She bookmarked the idea as one would mark a sharp knife in a chest. Useful, dangerous. System. Wish option viewed. Memory erasure. No commitment made. Her family gated through its own small cruelties like a choreography perfected by use. Her adoptive brother, a man with a clerk's face and a generous smile when profit was near, kept the ledger of their home and practiced a form of indifference at her expense that felt like a slow drip. He took things from the house and turned them into favors for the cousin who mattered. Her mother praised Yuanyuan in public and left Lin to arrange the family calendar like an unpaid assistant. Each act was a notch on the beam of her life, and yet she kept to herself in ways that taught her how to be visible without being consumable.
Where most people would have burned with the humiliation, she learned to hide the blaze and build a furnace from it. Warmth that could, if channeled, melt the kinds of chains people liked to place on women they considered lesser. The opportunity that changed everything was a marriage ask. Not hers at first, not in the purely romantic sense. The Zhang family, burdened by a different kind of misfortune, needed something no one else could easily supply. Zhang Yuanyuan, their scion and a powerful officer, had been reduced to a husk by an accident. He lay in the hospital like a tumbled statue, eyes fluttering but mostly silent. He wore a hospital gown like a uniform that no one wanted to remove.
The Jiang elders came to the Lin estate with the kind of plan that smelled of negotiations. Alliances were proposed with the polish of draft documents. They wanted a marriage, an outward sign to re-anchor their good fortune and bury the public whispers about Yuanyuan's condition beneath the weight of money and loyalty. In the Lin family's calculus, the match would move their station up, close rifts, and trade the family's bad luck for new heir. Nobody asked Lin Mian whether she wanted to be the vessel for someone else's return. They asked her as if she were an inevitable piece in a game she had not agreed to join. Her adoptive parents framed it as duty, as a sacrifice for the family name. Lin Yuanyuan smiled in a way that suggested she might take some social credit for sacrificing a sister's life to the clan. The terms were public and ugly. Lin Mian in exchange for social forgiveness and a promise of security that read on paper as a fortress. Lin Mian listened to the offers like one listens to the wind. She weighed them with a pragmatism that had not let her be undone. The system's notification blinked like an answering chime. System, new mission, host option, proposed marriage to Jiang Yuanyuan, potential reward, multiple wish credits, risk, high. It was a high-risk move, like putting a monarch's crown on a pawn. The Jiang family had power. Their wealth could rewire a life. Marrying into that world could cure physical problems, purchase protections, and place Lin in a position of strength she had never been permitted. It could also make her the public face of a bargain she had not truly consented to. The system did not tell her which choice would keep her soul intact. She knew the cost. The system had made that clear by the mechanics it insisted upon. To obtain multiple wish credits, she had to unlock a cascade, a consecutive series of missions that increased a target's love score and moved public perception incrementally without betraying the whole plan too early. Each mission had to be precise. The final mission of the cascade, the 100th humiliation, had to be staged as a culminating public beating, a capstone that would make the reversal complete. The system counted. It never missed.
Lin Mian, private thought. If I marry him, it's not surrender. It's a rearrangement. It's a new center. She signed the legal papers with hands that did not tremble. The signature felt like a hinge turning. Nobody in her family looked surprised. They had already written the press release in their heads. The Lin estate rehearsed its social lines like a choir. Yuanyuan sent her a smile that was 3 parts pity to 1 part triumph. Gu's eyes flicked an extra time, a small ownership claim on the idea that she was removing herself from his board. But a marriage with the Jiang family was not merely the conclusion of other people's designs. It was, for Lin Mian, the most strategic move she had made. If she completed the cascade, if she moved 100 private slights into a public ledger and used the final blow to flip the narrative, she would not be a victim, she would be a gatekeeper. There was a night before the engagement where she walked to the cliffs where the ocean made itself into white teeth against rock. The place was called Lover's Cliff for old marketing reasons, but for the Lin family it had become a spot of reconciliations and threats. People went there to make a promise or to throw one away under the sky's indifferent watch. Gu met her there without fanfare, cane in hand, a dramatic prop and a confession. "You are making yourself a prize harder to claim," he said, voice rasping in the wind. "It's not a prize," she corrected. "It's a post." He chuckled, bitter. "You have always loved words more than people, Mian, to call a thing by another name." "I call it by what it will get me," she said. The ocean bellowed. A single rose, the Lover's Cliff rose, stripped and red and held with the residue of rain, trembled in her fingers like a tiny heart. Gu watched her fingers curl around it. He dropped to his knee, a gesture that was neither courtship nor humiliation. It was an ancient way for a man to show he could still be in a position to bargain. "If it helps you," he said, "if marrying into the Jiang family keeps you from being crushed, do it." She wanted to say he had no idea what crushed felt like. She wanted to say that she had been a compressed thing for many years, that she had learned to make room inside that compression for plans. Instead, she handed the rose back. It smelled faintly of salt. "Play your hand carefully," she told him, "because when you think you're in control, you forget how to play to win." He laughed, and it had a crack in it now. "You will keep the jade?" She slipped the bracelet onto her wrist, and the jade rested like a small, cool future. Not as pawn, as token. System. Mission cascade initialized. Targets. Gu Huaichuan, Jiang Yuanyuan. Total required humiliations to finalize cascade, 100. Current humiliation count, 96/100. 96. The number felt closer to a precipice than it had a month ago.
The labored steps of the plan gathered speed like wind before a storm.
Marrying into the Jiang family would require public optics, engagement dinners, staged condolences, visits to the hospital where Yanxin slept like a man in amber. It required Lin to be seen as the sainted instrument of salvage for a noble family. It required Gu to see his power sliding. In the weeks that followed, the system logged everything it could. Each dinner, each whispered rumor, each photograph was an annotation. The more she gave herself to being a visible fixture in the Jiang narrative, the more the love score algorithm, an ugly, clinical engine that measured small gestures and public sentiment, favored the Jiang family's recovery. It recorded not emotions but outcomes: headlines, engagement party attendance, rising donations. The system did not care about dignity. It cared about measurable shifts. Lin's daily life became a choreography: smile at the right moments, touch Yanxin's hand in a way cameras might notice, appear at charity events where cameras would feed the city an image of the couple before they were truly a couple. The third-party narratives told themselves in formulaic headlines: "Miracle bride-to-be brings hope to officer." The line tasted like iron on her tongue. Gu's responses were not static either. At first, he increased in small acts of interference: an offhand remark to a reporter, a photograph that appeared to show him consoling a society columnist who had been paid to smear the Jiang family a year earlier. Later, he grew desperate, in ways she could detect in the tremor of his hands or the length of his silences. The limp grew more pronounced. His public persona split, part man of leisure, part man unraveling. That split was a wedge she needed to pry open. Her nights before the engagement party were restless with calculation. She wrote little lists that she folded into her notepad: press strategy, lines for interviews, possible uses of wish credits. The memory erasure wish sat like a blade in the corner of the page. She thought how clean it would be to remove her own name from the mouths of those who had used it as a tool. She thought about the moral cost. She thought about what it meant to be free, but for the sake of someone else's oblivion. The coronation of the engagement was itself a festival of optics. The Lin estate had been scrubbed and dressed to augment the story. Cameras filmed her in soft light as she accepted a ring and an announcement. Yuanyuan stood close and offered a practiced smile that carried the weight of being a child favored. Reporters wrote schmoozy pieces about destiny and resilience. Guests raised glasses to a narrative that revered sacrifice. When Gu walked into the reception that night, the air went taut. He carried the bracelet in his pocket as if it were a talisman, and wore a coat that hid the limp but not the exhaustion in his eyes. He moved around the room like a man who had not decided whether to applaud the spectacle or to sabotage it.
"You know," he said finally, and for a moment he sounded less like the man who had humiliated her in public and more like the one who had once perhaps loved her enough to be complicated about it. "If you choose to go through with this marriage, I will not make it easy on you." There was steel in the sentence that was not empty threat. It was a promise of friction, of a man who refused to slink into irrelevance. That could mean many things, and the ambiguity of his intent had always been his most dangerous tool. She smiled in a way that was not a smile for him, but a small private gesture to herself. "Then don't," she said. "Make it worth both of our while." He considered her in the way men often considered arrangements, as a proposition, as a possibility. For a moment his face softened like a tide, then it hardened again. The presence of the system, that still, clinical chime that had become the metronome of her life, vibrated in the background like an indifferent metronome. System. Humiliation count incremented. 99-100. 99. It wasn't the last humiliation she had survived. It was the public ledger counting down to a hinge. The number felt heavy and alive, like a held breath. In the mouth of the night, with the city gleaming below like a bed of careless lights, she felt both closer to triumph and farther from the simple peace she had imagined as a child. She did not sleep. In the room when she tried to rest, the jewels of her past and the promises of her future pressed on opposite shelves. The heirloom bracelet lay like a small, resolute animal on the nightstand. The lover's cliff rose withered in a glass. Her phone vibrated once with the system's clear, unbiased voice. "System. Final mission trigger available. Recommendation. Proceed with high caution. Rewards. 2 wish credits upon completion." I could feel the geometry of choice under my ribs. To go forward was to accept the finale. The 100th counted humiliation would not be what it had been to her. It would be the turning point. Either she would complete the cascade and claim the wishes that could heal the officer and make her family powerless to humiliate her, or she would refuse and remain in the economy of small cruelties that had been her life for so long.
A single knock at her door cut the night into a sharp, immediate present. She opened to find Jang Young-kin's sister in the doorway, slender, tired, the kind of woman who had watched a brother fade and learned the language of negotiation out of grief. Her presence meant the Jang family had final questions, final conditions. "Miss Lin," the sister said, voice low, "we need to walk this through, for the sake of Young-kin." Lin looked at her for a long, uncomplicated second. "Then speak plainly."
The woman stepped inside, closed the door on the noise of the party, and in the small, clinical light of the suite, enumerated the terms: appearance obligations, public charity commitments, visiting hours at the hospital, legal clauses tying estates and property. Her voice had an economy of careful syllables that matched the system in its efficiency. It was a map. When she finished, Lin Mian kept two thoughts to herself. One was a list of things she would not allow the marriage to be. She would not relinquish decision-making about her own life. She would not be used as a tool without consent. She would not allow anyone to frame her as merely a gesture. The second was the final one she had not told even the system, that when the cascade reached the hinge, she intended to choose the wish that would stitch Yuanyuan whole. She had seen him once, in a pale hospital bed, and recognized the raw human inside the family's public armor. Healing him was not merely a bargaining chip. It was a means to create an ally who would, by gratitude and survival, become a protector rather than a condemner. The door closed on them both. Outside, the city did not know what was being decided inside a cluttered suite. Inside, she allowed herself a tiny private admission. She was tired of being invisible. She was tired of being the thing people used for proofs of loyalty. She wanted the room in the world that would not allow her to be reclassified as collateral. The system blinked once more, a tiny mechanical pulse in the screen, like a heartbeat for a machine. "System, final cascade begins in 72 hours. Prepare. Engagement announcement, public ceremony, staged. Note, 1 humiliation remaining to trigger cascade conclusion." 72 hours. The corridor of time before the engagement ceremony was finite and humming. She had 3 days to arrange the final moves, to ensure the 100th humiliation would not be a repetition, but a capstone that would topple the power that had been exerted over her for years. In the small hours, when the house quieted and the city hummed, she sat with the jade bracelet cupped in both hands and let the heavy, unlit possibility of the memory eraser wish orbit her like a dangerous star. She thought of the man who had humiliated her, of the way he laughed, the way he had made the bracelet into a symbol and then a prize and then a weapon. She imagined him without those memories and felt a complicated ache, something of mercy, something of betrayal. A shadow moved outside her window. Gu stood on the terrace, a silhouette against the dredge of light, cane in hand like a precarious scepter. When she stepped onto the terrace, the air had the salt tang of the cliff. He did not look like a man who would cry in public, but her intuition, the quiet thing that had been honed by years of answering to the world while keeping scores, told her he was fraying. "Tomorrow," he said, voice thin, "there will be cameras in abundance." "Yes," I said. He looked at her long enough that she felt he was trying to find the part of her he had once owned and failing to locate it. "Don't let them break you." "They already tried," she replied. "I learned how to barricade." He exhaled, a sound like someone forgiving himself. For a heart-staggering second, the man he had once been surfaced. Not the master Gu, the dealer, the humiliator, but the faint memory of someone who had once loved clumsily. Tears gathered in his eyes like the first betrayals of rain. She watched them but did not look away. "Whatever happens tomorrow," she said softly, "know that you made me sharper. That is not all your fault." He stared at her then, and there was a small, terrible edge to the way he blinked, as though drying something in his throat. The system recorded his micro-expressions with a dispassionate notation. It did not account for human collapse. It only counted the raw metrics. System. Target emotion variance detected. Gu Huaichan. Report. Nervous system dysregulation. When he stepped back into the light and disappeared from the terrace, Lin Mian closed the door and felt the house settle her toward the final days. 99 humiliations were registered like a living will. The last would either confirm the system's currency or flip it into a weapon that would be used with restraint. She slept poorly and rose earlier than the rest of the house. Outside, the city exhaled a winter blue, and in the hospital, the corridors smelled of disinfectant and exhaustion. The man she would marry slept in a world that had lost color.
When she watched Zhang Yanqin in his sleep, a fragile reed of a person with the weight of an entire family's future pressing against his chest, she felt the strange human surge of wanting to save someone, even if it was also strategic. A nurse came in and adjusted his blanket with a practiced tenderness. Lin sat under the stiff light and folded her hands as if in prayer, though she was not a praying woman. She only observed the human in front of her as she might observe a map, the lines, the vulnerable arteries, the failings. She thought of the wish, the healing credit hidden in the system like a sliver of redemption, and the way it might save this man and change the ledger of the lives around them. A soft beep came from her phone. The system made no sudden moves unless she authorized them, but it informed. The words were short and clinical. System. Mission trigger confirmed. Final humiliation scheduled. Recommendation. Minimize physical escalation. Maximize public perception impact. The nurse looked at her with quiet curiosity, the kind of look that belongs to people who watch things and ask themselves if they should intervene. Are you ready for today? I am, which was not the same as telling the truth. Outside the hospital window, the sky was a color like thin paper. Lin Mian felt the ledger in her skin like a map of scars.
When she left the hospital to prepare for the engagement announcement later that day, she paused on the pavement and closed her eyes. The city moved and the system hummed, and the world, which had always been loud with other people's definitions, began to tighten down to a single sequence of moves. She would walk into the ceremony as they expected her to, demure, thankful, a woman who had saved a family. She would stand where cameras could see her, and a man who had once used her would be mandated to perform his last act. 99 humiliations had readied the room. Only one remained. System. Humiliation count, 99-100. Final trigger window, 12 hours. She straightened her shoulders, feeling for the first time in years the raw possibility that power could be engineered. She thought about the jade bracelet on her wrist and the way its coolness steadied her. She thought about the rose from Lover's Cliff, the cane Gu used, the hospital. She straightened the small badge on her dress, an emblem sewn into the lapel that made no one notice its meaning but made her feel steadier. The engagement announcement would be a public theater of allegiances, cameras at every angle, socialites in practiced faces, threads of influence unspooling like fishing line. In 12 hours, the ledger would either close or snap. Before she left the house that morning, she received one small deliberate message, part habit and part signal. System. Final cascade active. Humiliation count, 99-100. Final trigger window, 800 to 2000. Recommendation. Stage for maximum public sympathy. If this is the kind of story that grabs you, stay with it to the end. She had not spoken those words, but there was a clarity in the line that felt like an invitation. She stepped into the day like someone stepping into a strategy she'd rehearsed 1,000 times in thinner light. The city was bright with an ordinary kind of cruelty. Delivery trucks, children in uniforms, men who had been born into the idea of entitlement. Lin Mian moved through it in a gown that covered the lines she did not wish photographed. The jade bracelet hummed against her wrist, a private metronome. The Lover's Cliff rose, pressed in a bit of damp tissue and wrapped behind a hairpin in her hair, smelled faintly of salt and rain whenever she leaned close to herself. Small talismans against a world that had been loud with other people's definitions. At the venue, the municipal hall dressed in borrowed silk, cameras began to settle like birds on electric wire. The Zhang family arrived like a bluff of storm cloud, elders with surgical smiles, attendants who arranged distance, the sister who had visited her the night before appearing tired but orchestrated. Zhang Yanqin was there, his body still wrapped in layers of recovery imagery. He sat in a back room, propped on cushions, while the world prepared a performance around him. Lin's role in it was both instrument and architect.
The Lin family hovered like a contained weather system on the side. Yuanyuan, poised, too bright, the favored daughter, smiled the way someone who believes in entitlement always does, as if the universe owes them even the light. Her parents had rehearsed their faces for the cameras. Gu had not yet arrived. When he did, people noticed the way the room adjusted. He came with a cane that looked ceremonial, and a jacket that hid a lithe, dangerous energy. He moved like a man keeping his balance, both physically and socially. The engagement announcement was a series of rehearsed moments, introductions, toasts, the careful revelation of a ring. Journalists who made their livelihoods on the gentle violence of celebrity wrote lines that were waiting for paste to be stuck into column space. For months, this had been the line of the formula. A woman gives herself to a family that needs her resurrection.
Tonight, the script promised redemption in headlines. The first half of the evening went to plan. Photographers recorded Lin Mian's demure smile as she accepted the Zhang elder's thanks. Cameras trained on the intersection of her fingers in the ring showed the bracelet once more on her wrist as a detail of origin. People mouthed the right words. The system watched, anonymous and indifferent. System. Audience sympathy metrics, increase. Public perception index, +7. It was in the lull after the speeches, when the press clusters thinned and the music dropped into a soft loop, that the instigators moved. Humiliations in the cascade had never been a single blow. They had been a slow, calibrated drip. Tonight they intended the final drip to be a spectacle that could not be ignored. Lin Yuanyuan took the stage under the pretense of offering a sisterly blessing. Her microphone was live. The cameras loved family drama served as charity. "Isn't this what we've always hoped for?" she began, voice syruped. "To see our misfortune turned into fortune, to see sacrifice build as heroism." The phrase landed like a pebble with the right folks. A few cameras flicked to the Lin family. A coo of approval rippled. There was a careful bite in the comment, enough to be a sting, but practiced to look like concern. Lin Mian felt the number in her like a breath. 99 had been the count that had hung over her for days. She had anticipated Yuanyuan's move, because some cruelties are predictable when they are cultivated. She tilted her head, smiling for the cameras with a softness she kept for rehearsed moments. Yuanyuan's smile sharpened. "It's brave," she said louder, "for someone to sacrifice so much for another family's return. I do hope, for the sake of everyone involved, that this ends well." There were polite, supportive noises. A critic in the back scribbled an angle. The camera snapped closer.
Now, the prime humiliation others hoped to stage was an act that would appear like exposure, a staged reveal that Lin Mian was in it for wealth, that she had always been a mercenary, that the jade bracelet was kept not as an heirloom, but as an object of bargaining. The room hung on the potential of the spectacle. Gu moved then, but not in the way anyone expected. He stepped forward, his hand inside his coat, the jade bracelet visible for the cameras when he put his palm over it in a casual, possessive gesture. For a heartbeat, the audience read him as protector. He had done that before. Then he did something the planners had not fully accounted for. The bracelet slipped from his hand as though someone had brushed past him. It clattered against the stage and flew into the footlights, catching the photographer's flash. There was the small, private silence that comes right before a public uproar. A younger reporter lunged to pick up the bracelet. Yuanyuan laughed like a cut glass breaking. "How apt," she said. "The trinket we pried loose so theatrically placed again in the narrative." Before the meaning of the line could settle, Gu bent down to pick up the bracelet and, in a motion that could have been tenderness or a show of reclaiming, raised it between his fingers. The sound the system made was almost inaudible to human ears. System. Humiliation count incremented. 100, 100. Final cascade complete. Wish credits available, 2. Reward pool unlocked. For the people in the room, it was a gesture that could read as a reunion. For the system, it was the closing of a loop. For Lin Mian, it was the hinge she had spent her life building toward. She had intended the cascade to complete. She had not built it to crush with spectacle, but to open a door. The difference was subtle and crucial. A man in the crowd shouted something, an accusation thinly veiled as observation. The press fancied it into a narrative. Betrayal, gold. The cameras leaned. The old script read as such, the poor bride accused of mercenary motives. But the engine Lin Mian had been learning to drive was not the same engine as the Lin family's old social machine. She had guided the narrative toward empathy for the Zhang family, toward a picture of a woman stepping in to rescue rather than ransom. The 100th humiliation, staged to appear as a last public slight, instead set off a different flare in the public imagination. A woman reunited with a family talisman, a man in fragile recovery being given anything that might anchor him. People looked twice at Yuanyuan, who had come for a spectacle, and then at Gu, who held the bracelet like a guilty thing. A succession of shallow comments broke into gasps. The lead reporter whose career relied on schadenfreude hesitated. The camera operator sensed the story shift.
Cameras pivoted, focusing on the small, tender gestures. Lin's hand on the ring, the jade catching light, the old man's eyes misting with private memory that the cameras could not read as cruelty. System. Public sentiment shift in favor of host. Media framing index, 68%, protective. And then, as if the room itself could no longer bear the ambiguity,
Gu stood with a movement that contained all of a man's old pride and the fresh break of its fracture. He moved to the edge of the stage, and in a voice that trembled between accusation and confession, said, "This isn't what I wanted, but perhaps you all prefer stories about sacrifice. You like the shape of a woman who gives herself away to save a family." There was a rustle. Someone in the crowd laughed cruelly. Someone else booed. Gu's words cut a line that could be read as a last attempt to regain the narrative. He was still a provocateur. He always had been. His cane tapped a rhythm against the stage boards. Zhang Yanqin, who had been pale and wan, now mouthing prayer-like syllables to himself, stirred in the back room. The system pinged in her lap with an author as precise and cold as any marketplace contract. System. Wish credit access granted. 2 credits available. Action options. 1. Apply medical healing wish. Instant protocol. 2. Memory erasure wish. Selective case. Note. Multiple wishes usable. Consequences. See legal/moral footnotes. She had promised herself she would restore him. That had been the thread she kept folded into the larger map. Now the wish credits were in her palm like 2 knives. One of repair, one of erasure. Both could be used in that room with everyone watching, and both would change lives irrevocably. Gu's voice rose, naked and raw. "You will be a bride of convenience. You will be their banner. And when the banners have been raised, who will you be for us?" Someone cried out. The cameras closed in. For a breath, the old tableau, a woman shrinking in public, a man asserting dominance, might have completed itself. But Lin Mian had conditioned the room. She had placed the cameras where they would catch not the humiliation, but the betrayal. She held the bracelet forward now, not as a pawn to be moved, but like an offering and a bargain she intended to keep. The jade glimmered in a stage light, as if the past could be cut to shine. "Gu," she said, low, so only those near enough could hear. "This isn't about what you want." He looked at her then with an expression she had seen before, a particular mixture of regret and ownership. There was a small, jagged thing in his mouth, a smile that tried to be an apology and turned into something else. "Then what is it about?" he asked. "About not being used as an example," she answered. "About being allowed to choose where I stand. About making sure there's a man who can hold his own because he was healed, not because he's bound to us by pity." Gu's face lost the last of its steady color.
The room felt like an animal that had been startled into motion. He tried one of the old moves, a taunt meant to cut airways, meant to get a reaction that would bring him back into relevance. "And if you choose to heal him," Gu said, "then you will owe them everything." At that, the system pulsed again, as if in sympathy with the cold arithmetic she had been living by. System. Wish execution confirmation requested. Select wish type. Confirm? Yes/no. There was no applause in the pause. There were only faces. The Zhang elders with their practiced hope, the Lin family with their private intentions, reporters wired to manufacture nuance, and Gu, who had been reduced to a visibly tremoring man whose control had been unstitched one secret thread at a time. Lin could spend the credit here and now, in public, convert performance into literal flesh. She saw the look in Zhang Yanqin's sister's face. More than any speech, it catalogued the vacuum their family had been living in, the long months of hovering between hope and grief, the ache of a brother so close to being gone. She thought, too, of how healing him might change where the social power settled. She tapped yes. System. Wish execution. Medical healing protocol initiated. Autonomous medical unit deploying. ETA 120 seconds. Effect. Restorative neuromuscular regeneration. Composite rehabilitation. Note. Procedure visible to present audience. When the system announced deployment, nurses and technical staff who had been hovering in the wings moved with a new urgency. It felt, from the vantage of the crowd, like a sudden quickening. Technicians wheeling into the back room, a whir of equipment, the flash of a machine that looked more like a med transport than an enchanted object. The cameras pivoted. The press smelled a miracle. The staff worked with efficient hands. The ministerial air, an odd mixture of hospital sterility and stagecraft,
closed over Jiang Yangqin like a mask. Lin stood watching the door where the medical team had disappeared, feeling the weight of two promises, one to a man who had been reduced to a symbol, another to herself. Gu did something then that surprised even those who had catalogued him as cruel for years. He took off his coat and set it on an adjacent chair. The motion stripped a worn armor and left him in the light of the room, uncannily bare. People leaned in. His eyes were wet with something that could be mistaken for apology. "I'm not asking to be forgiven," he said, voice racked. I only want—" He could not finish. The confession had no hospitable ending. The camera lenses recorded the compression of a man's chest and the way his hands fumbled with the cane as if it were now a thing that could not be worn for pride. He looked less like a measured puppet master and more like a man who had run out of masks.
When the technicians wheeled Jiang Yangqin out, the room shifted. A hush formed as a body that had been hollowed resumed shape. Pale lips moved. The first intake of breath was small, like someone who had been underwater and had finally broken the surface. Color threaded back into cheeks. Eyes opened. The first blink was a revelation. A man who did not yet know his place in the world, but who was alive inside his face. He sat on the edge of the bed, hands fumbling with a blanket. Then, with slow, tentative motion, he rose. His legs held. The cane, which had been a part of the hospital ritual, left his fingers like a cast-off. He walked to the door as if the world had grown to meet him. The cameras surged forward. People shouted. The Jiang elders pressed a hand to their mouths. For the first time in months, the narrative pulled toward the miracle of return rather than the spectacle of sacrifice. And in that raw, fragile space, Lin watched a man who was now physically present look into the room and find the person he'd been introduced to as a savior. He looked at Lin Mian, not as a symbol, but as a woman who had been standing in the light for hours. "You all did this?" he asked, voice thick with surprise and an unpracticed gratitude. His gaze landed on Gu like a blind man who had once known a face and now could not place it. Gu, who had come to dominate scenes by accusation, reeled under the unaccustomed gentleness of being irrelevant. The words he had prepared to peer were swallowed by the new locus of attention. He felt the bruise of obsolescence. Jiang Yangqin moved across the floor with a steadiness that surprised him and the room. He approached Gu and stopped at an arm's length, offering no theatrics and no public cruelty. He could have spoken a sentence of triumph that would have ruined the man, but he did not. Instead, he placed his hand lightly on Gu's shoulder as if offering help. Gu crumpled there, not in violence, but in a surrender. Tears spilled from his eyes, hot and uncalculated. There was no faded pride left to be burned. He knelt on the hardwood floor like someone who had been required to come clean. The wail that escaped him was human and ragged in a way the cameras, which had been waiting for spectacle, had not bargained for. He cried. It was not the calculated breakdown of a man seeking sympathy. It was a raw, fragile fissure exposed under the glare. People rose from their seats in confusion. The Lin family watched with mixed feelings, triumph, discomfort, and awareness that the man they had enjoyed reducing had been humanly refolding. The system registered the shift with its usual indifferent precision. System. Target emotion variance. Gu Huaichuan. Emotional collapse detected. Media sensitivity high. In the chaos of the moment, Lin felt an ache that was not victory. She felt relief, certainly. The cascade had closed, the wishes were in hand, but also the unnameable unsettledness of someone who had engineered a man's fall and now saw the human cost. The spectacle had become something else entirely. The cameras pivoted toward Jiang Yangqin as he steadied himself. He did not demand the floor with vengeance. Instead, he offered a quiet strength that was less about assertion and more about presence. He looked at Lin Mian, and with a gesture that required no words and no scripts, he took her hand. It was not a takeover, it was an anchor. The room recognized, in that small physicality, the sense of a partnership that might become a refuge rather than a banner. The system's interface pulsed again on her screen, waiting like an accountant at the edge of ethics. System. Wish credits, 2 available. Usage remaining, 2. Proceed to select. It was time for the second decision, the choice she had considered for nights, the one that sat like a sharp instrument in a drawer, glinted in her mind with stubborn privacy. The memory erasure option had the clean logic of freedom, remove herself from the minds of those who had used and hurt her, strip their leverage, and in exchange give herself the space to live without the barbs of old wounds. But the system's fine print had not been erased by her desire. It had warned clinically about collateral damage, families splintered by gaps of memory, identity reconfigured, the moral residue of taking another person's past for the sake of your peace. She saw Gu's face, slick with tears,
shaped by authentic ache. The man who had broken her heart in small, surgical ways, who had taken a bracelet and made it a trophy, who had orchestrated humiliation to cultivate power, he now knelt and sobbed on the floor like a child. The juxtaposition hammered into her chest. There was mercy mixed with the wish for finality. If she used the memory erasure on Gu and the Lin family, it would not make them less human. It would make their histories softer, their punitive edges dulled. They would not remember the specific pains, the slights. But the system had warned that memories are stitches, and when stitches are removed, surfaces gap. People could still feel an ache without knowing its cause. Gu might wake tomorrow and hold a cottage ache of loss, confused by an absence he could not name. Her parents might still be kind in some ways and cruel in others, their behavior unmoored by missing recollection. The ethical ledger wobbled. She imagined waking up the next morning and seeing Gu on the terrace, not looking at her as the woman he'd teased, but with a strange and painful blankness where their shared history had once been. Would it be mercy to free herself from that reflected cruelty if it meant consigning him to a life of unmoored sorrow? The question held her like an insoluble puzzle. Jang Yongqin's fingers tightened around hers.
He saw the strain in her face, and by a move that felt as protective as anything she had seen all evening, nodded once. She did not need his consent, the wishes were hers, but in the small physicality, the affirmation felt like companionship rather than ownership. She authorized the second wish. System. Confirmation required. Memory erasure wish. Selected recipients. Gu Huaichuan. Lin parents. Lin Yuanyuan. Scope. Removal of memories pertaining to host's existence and associated humiliation events. Acknowledge long-term consequences. Yes/no. She chose yes. System. Wish execution initiated. Targets. Gu Huaichuan. Lin parents. Lin Yuanyuan. Process. Selective memory dampening. Active timer 60 seconds. Caution. Emotional aftereffects likely. Legal dissonance possible. The minutes that followed were like those she had felt before other pivotal acts, composed in the world but tumultuous inside. She tried to find in Gu's face any last remnant of menace worth preserving as a lesson to be taught, something she might have wanted him to remember as penance. She did not find it. She found a man undone in ways that escaped the ledger she had kept. It made her stomach drop. The system acted like it always did, dispassionate, exact. On the cameras, the room continued to rustle with interpretations. On her phone, the interface counted down. System. Memory erasure processing, 40% complete. Gu's cries subsided to soft hiccups. His shoulders shook. He looked at Lin as if searching for something he could not name. His mouth formed a sound that was not quite a question. Lin felt the sudden crushing awareness that she was about to remove his capacity to make sense of his own shame. She had steeled herself for anger, for a last gloating feeling she might savor. Instead, she felt weary. She felt the accumulation of years of small cruelties and the way they had been stacked like a building she had been forced to live under. The wish felt like a way out and a way to spare herself daily, intimate torments, to get the ledger turned over and sealed. But she also knew that memory is a teacher. To erase was to remove the possibility of a lesson surviving in the one who needed it most. System. Memory erasure processing, 72. The Lin parents looked affected too, a blanking of recognition where their daughter had long been a liability. The currency of their family life, the small humiliations they used to keep the house ordered, faded like a smell in time. Yuanyuan's expression wavered between irritation and a confusion that had no clear object. There was an immediate moral cost that the system's dry language had predicted, but that no algorithm could fully register, a human emptiness where narrative once lived. People would wake with a subtle absence and not be able to name its contours. They would be kinder in some ways and more unmoored in others. The legal frameworks of memory and responsibility did not have clear protocols for excised histories. She had asked to be free. The cost was now an uncertain, shifting thing. Zhang Yanqin watched her with a look that was tender and immediate, and not yet informed by narrative. He did not ask her for explanation. He simply squeezed her hand as if to say he would be with her no matter what shape tomorrow took. The system pinged again, like a ledger updating itself. System. Wish credits remaining, 0. Mission cascade, complete. Rewards dispensed, 2 wish credits applied. Recommendations. Monitor targets for emotional dissonance. The cameras had become complicit archivists of a quiet, complex turn.
Social feeds exploded with theories, with 1,000 little moral essays about agency, revenge, and mercy. For Lin, the noise felt distant, an outer skin. Inside was the feeling of a room emptied of some of the old knives she had learned to guard against, and the deeper feeling of what she had placed into effect. Gu remained on the floor for some time, breathing shallowly. His tears left tracks that dried into the grain of his face. The public watched and tried to translate the ache into morality. There were voices that claimed heroism on both sides, those who said Lin had used the system for righteous protection, those who said she had unjustly taken from others their right to memory, and therefore their right to change. The argument would rage over op-eds and late-night shows. None of it could reweave the small domestic habits that had once made up a person's inner script. In the quiet after the storm, Zhang Yanqin stood at the dais, and not through spectacle, but through a quiet choice, asked the room to allow the evening to return to the ceremony planned. He spoke without grandiosity. "Tonight is a promise," he said, voice recovered with a surprising steadiness. "A promise to try. A promise to begin again." He extended his hand to Lin, and then, in a motion that had no claim in the old sense of ownership, invited her to walk to the front with him. The cameras leaned, then softened. It was not about domination. It was about a partnership that had been forged in choice. Lin walked with him down the aisle to the front of the room, and in the flash of dozens of lenses, she felt a reality shift under her feet.
The humiliation ledger had closed, and a different kind of ledger had opened. Commitments, caretaking, power carefully assigned. People in the crowd who had earlier smirked were now watching the quiet dignity of two humans deciding to try to make a life of mutual tending. It was not a fairy tale. It was an arrangement built by someone who had once been invisible and wanted to stay visible on her own terms. After the ceremony, which concluded without the bombast of insult, the newlyweds moved through the room like two people together, togetherness a shield that the cameras could not fully translate. They were greeted by some with warmth, by others with suspicion, by many with a curiosity tired of spectacle. Among the well-wishers was Zhang Yanqin's sister, who held Lin's hand and whispered a thank you that had the shape of relief. The aftermath unfolded in small human ways. Gu was escorted quietly to a room by attendants who treated him with a care that bordered on pity. He slept for several hours, exhausted by a breakdown that had been both long building and swift. When he woke, the absence of memory remained, flashes without referent. He felt an ache he could not name, and wandered once to the terrace where he had once stood and plotted. She watched from a distance as he stood looking at the city. A part of her wanted to go and say something that would draw the arc of what had happened. Another part knew the cruel logic that would fold any confession into another humiliation. She did not go. The line between compassion and enabling old cruelty is thin. She had made her choice. In the weeks that followed, the new life took shape with a slow, ordinary accumulation of small acts. Zhang Yanqin's recovery continued with physiotherapy and small, stubborn progress. He learned again how to hold a cup, to tie a tie, to smile with the muscles of a man who had been asleep to himself. He was not the man he might have been had he never been harmed. He was instead a man learning presence. Lin found her days filled with a different set of calculations: household decisions, the management of estates, the translation of social capital into protections. The system, no longer the metronome of humiliation in her life, hummed less frequently on her screen. It still recorded outcomes in its blunt, accurate way: public perception numbers, custodial legal effects, the trace of wish usage. She checked it sometimes out of habit, and found the dryness of its language both comforting and alien. Gu's life took a different arc. Without the immediate scaffolding of memory that supplied his old authority, he found himself unemployed by the scripts he had learned: what to say to retain power, how to call people to attention with the right mix of charm and menace. He tried to rebuild with the cruel tools he had available: small investments in boutique restaurants, odd jobs at exclusive clubs. But a man without his stories can be untethered. He stumbled through new social circuits like someone trying to find a language he'd once spoken with ease. There were moments when he would look up, as if to ask for something he could not name: recognition, apology, the right to feel his past as prism rather than chain. He would sometimes stand on the terrace at dawn, the air cold, hands folded in the way of someone who used to give orders but now only asked questions of the horizon. Once he tried to make a call to Lin Mian and hung it up before the phone left his ear, as if an unformulated instinct told him the action would be rude without context. People in the city debated the justice of her choice. There were moralists who spun stories of cruelty returned in kind. There were practical commentators who praised her for securing safety. Lin learned to make do with the noise. She had what she'd come for: autonomy that had been bought with cunning, a husband who would be a partner rather than a captain, and a family that could not reach for her as the old weapon. But she did not find the catharsis she had imagined. Memory, after all, had been a ledger she had used to tally wounds. Erasing it had not made the wounds vanish from her body. It had only closed the book on the ledger that others had used to justify their behavior. She still had nights where the count of small cruelties arrived in her chest like a bruise. She still sometimes woke with a phantom ache of humiliation that no public ledger could scrub. The system had removed the sources she had primed for the sake of survival, but it had not rearranged the architecture of her inner life. Jiang Yanqin, on the other hand, proved to be a companion who practiced the simplest and most radical forms of care: presence and small, unwavering decisions to choose the same person each morning. He did not take ownership of her in ways that made her smaller. He asked questions about her past and listened without demanding details she might not wish to share. His gratitude was not performative. It was a quiet, human insistence to be there. They built, slowly, a life where power and mercy were balanced by an ongoing, careful conversation about limits. When Lin confessed to him, weeks after the ceremony, about the memory erasure wish in a moment of private honesty, he did not admonish her with the easy moralism of media pundits. He asked instead how she felt, and then asked what she needed now. "You didn't have to do this alone," he said, as if stating the obvious that people rarely mean. His hands were warm, the hands of a man who had not always had the capacity to offer steadiness. "It wasn't simple," she replied. "It never is when you're trying not to be eaten." He looked at her like a man who had been taught to read the subtler currencies of survival. "Then let's make the rest simpler," he said. There was a humility in his offer, a recognition that the past had been complicated and the future could be, with care, clearer.
As for Gua, the public watched him reshape his life with something like curiosity. There were moments of raw sadness that the cameras fed on, but there were also moments where the city allowed him space: a man taking a class in sculpture, an odd job at a fish market, a small volunteer role at a community center for men trying to find new rhythms. He never fully recovered the old persona that had made him so dangerous. He did not need to. He sometimes stumbled into the same patterns of entitlement, only to have them flinch and fall away before they could become harm. Once, months after the wedding, Lin saw Gua across a market street carrying a bag of oranges. He walked toward her with that shy, unfamiliar gait, and for a moment she wondered if the old scripts would reassert. He smiled an awkward, small smile and offered her an orange without context. The gesture was neither a plea nor a repentance. It was a human extension. She accepted it, and as they stood with the city humming around them, they did not speak of their past. There was no need to reforge old categories. Memory had been peeled away. What remained was the chance, for both of them, to choose new ways of being. She kept the jade bracelet on her wrist for a long time. It no longer clattered like a pawn, it settled like a charm. The Lover's Cliff rose, pressed in an album of wedding photos, survived as a tactile memory rather than a weapon. She walked through life with an agency she had engineered, at a cost she had negotiated, the hush left on other people's minds, the emptiness they would one day meet without names to pin it to. Some nights she felt shame for that choice, others she felt relief. Mostly she felt a complicated peace, the kind of life that is not free of contradictions, but is governed by her own decisions. There were people who still asked whether she had been cool, whether she had taken the easier path by erasing harms rather than facing the slow, public work of accountability. She would answer them sometimes, and not others. Those who had been hurt by her acts without knowing why sometimes recovered from the missing memories by forming new stories that were kinder. Those who had been her enemies often found themselves unmoored in odd ways, sometimes kinder without reason, sometimes adrift. Jiang Yanqin grew stronger, not only in body but in his capacity to stand in public with a kind of understated authority that did not need to dominate. He used the influence the marriage brought to shield a handful of people, activists, small clinics, rehabilitation programs, whose work he had observed and quietly admired. The power she had gained by marrying him was not used to crush, it was used, as she had always hoped, to build small places of refuge. In the evenings they would walk along the cliff path, not to dramatize some romantic ending, but because the wind there made it easier to think.
He would ask her about things she did not always want to tell him, and then listen, which seemed the most valuable currency he could offer.
She would sometimes speak of her childhood in click stories, of the way counts sat like bruises, of the system that had offered her a scalpel. He would listen and sometimes ask questions that were not invasive but were real. Once, on a gray afternoon, they walked to the edge of Lover's Cliff. Lin Mian took out the small, crinkled rose she had been keeping and handed it to him. He took it with both hands, like someone accepting something fragile. He looked at the horizon, then at her, and said, "You made a difficult choice, but you did it for a reason I can see." She thought of all the calculations she'd made to turn humiliation into leverage, of the bargain she had struck with the system. The cost was still living inside her. The justice had been partial and strange. But in the way the man at her side squeezed her fingers with an urgency that wanted to be kind, she could see that some part of what she'd engineered had become a scaffold for life that was worth bearing. "Maybe," she said, "maybe that's all any of us can do sometimes. Make choices with the information we have, and then try to be better in what comes next." He smiled, not a flash meant for headlines, but the slow, private kind of gratitude that lived in small domestic decisions. "Then let's be better," he said simply, and they walked back from the cliff together, not as conquerors of fate, but as two people who had learned how to choose each other in a complicated world. Across the city, stories of humiliation and triumph wove themselves into the cultural conversation for weeks and months. People wrote think pieces about agency and revenge. Some claimed Lin had become a new kind of monarch, others accused her of playing God. The system, which had begun as a cold instrument, faded in the public imagination into a queer mythline about the ways technology and desire intersect. But in the rooms where people quietly tended to the work of living, in the hospital wards and the small community centers, in the market stalls where Gu learned to sell oranges, the effects of the cascade were more practical than abstract. A man who had been cruel learned new rhythms. A woman had reclaimed a life that had been systematically minimized. A husband and wife learned to do the labor of choosing one another each morning. When the anniversary of the engagement came, Lin placed a single small rose from Lover's Cliff into a glass and set it by the window. The jade bracelet warmed against her skin. She had won in a way that felt less like victory and more like survival. It had cost other people's continuity of self. That cost pulsed beneath her, a reminder of the ethics that never fully disappear. She sat with Zhang Yongchen at dusk and watched the city make its ordinary, noisy art. He leaned against her shoulder and breathed in time with her. The system that had counted her humiliations was quiet for now, its cold metrics relegated to the margins of a life that had become messier and more humane. It remained for the public to debate whether the tears Gu had shed were punishment or pity, whether erasure was sympathy or cowardice. But in the small, raw ledger of the people who had lived this story, the ones who had been left to rebuild, and the ones who had been used and remade, there was an answer that could not fully be reported in headlines. Lin Mian had been humiliated 99 times. On the 100th, she walked down an aisle not into the maw of surrender, but into a place where power could be held as a means of protection. When the man who had humbled her the most crumbled into a simple human cry, she saw both the tragedy and the mercy of it. She had used the tools at her disposal to reconfigure a life that had long been defined by other people's definitions. She had bought herself distance and safety at a price that would be debated for a long time. And yet, in the quiet that followed, she had found a space to live under her own terms. The jade against her wrist felt like a promise she had kept to herself. The Lover's Cliff rose had wilted and dried, but still smelled of rain in some afternoons. She did not celebrate the downfall of another in a way that tasted like triumph. She acknowledged instead the bitter, complicated victory of choosing a life for the sake of not being eaten by it. And somewhere on a terrace under a morning sky, a man who had once measured power in other people's smallness wiped his face, tried to understand an ache he could not name, and slowly began, in uneasy steps, the difficult work of being human again.